I think one of the strengths of IMII is that it's an organization interested in innovation, as is Jeremy, but it brings together industry and government and academic institutions and others who are supportive of innovation in the minerals industry. And I think Jeremy helped set the case that industry can't innovate without people. So we're very pleased to, I'm very pleased to have that message communicated again, because I think it's important to reaffirm, and I'm very pleased that we have educators in the room to hear it and receive it. And our very next speaker is representing some of our post-secondary education membership, and she's Gina Grandy. She's the Dean of Business Administration at the University of Regina. She's also professor of strategy and leadership with the Hill Levine, is it Levine? Got it right? School of Business at the University of Regina. She's a trained leadership and performance coach. She consults in the areas of leadership, women in leadership, strategy and change, and her research and consulting experiences span for-profit, public sector, and non-profit organizations in Canada, the US, and the UK. Gina joined the University of Regina in 2013, and prior to that, she taught at numerous higher education institutions, including Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador, the University of New Brunswick, the Université de Moncton in New Brunswick as well, the International Institute of Business in Ukraine, and Northumbria University in England. She's co-editor of 2 books, and her award-winning research on leadership, gender, and women's experiences at work, stigmatized work, and case writing has been published widely. She has held research grants for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Canadian Institutes of Health Research. She's a past editor for Case Research Journal and currently serves on the as the regional editor for Gender and Management in International Journal, and also on an International Advisory Board for Management Learning. And today, as you can see from her title, she's speaking on advancing EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and mining through post-secondary education. So please welcome Gina to
So Al, I am old school because I have notes, hard copy notes. Bear with me. And maybe that is my fear of perhaps that I wouldn't be able to access my notes. So you have more faith than I do. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And Al, I want to thank you for the invitation to be here. It won't be a surprise, perhaps, based on what Al has said, that I don't come from STEM. I come from the business side, and some of Jeremy's comments really fitting to some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. I'll be talking about some aspects clearly related to STEM or have relevance to STEM. But I believe there are also opportunities more widely if we're looking at post-secondary education institutes and how we can advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in mining. So as Al has indicated, I come from the side of business where I'm currently the dean. But my areas of research are in women in leadership, women's entrepreneurship, and looking at, interesting enough, and this may cause some controversy a little bit later, but some of my research also looks at stigma and occupations that are stigmatized. And I might suggest that there's also some work in regards to how we might be able to get more people into mining if we acknowledge some of that, some of the stigma. And so I'm also have a high level of comfort with you disagreeing with me. So I'll put that right out there. And so we might have some very interesting questions that emerge as a result. I want to start with perhaps a broader context. So talking just very briefly about universities and who's in our universities, then talking a little bit about what we're seeing, and this is where Jeremy may agree or may not, and this is why this is I hope will be a great conversation around where we're seeing some of the initiatives on equity, diversity, inclusion in mining. And then how might we move forward looking at post-secondary and really some of those partnerships and building on what's already in place. This is a couple of years old now, but it is a survey of Canadian universities. And I just want to highlight in regards to looking at who's in our universities based on certain demographics. You'll see here where those arrows are and we look across. So if we look to graduate students, about 55% of graduate students across the country in universities are women. 40% are racialized individuals who represent equity-deserving groups that are racialized, 3.3% Indigenous, 5% or 6% persons with disability, and at the time of this, there were no stats around LGBTQ2S+, and when we see intersectionalities of people's identity. If we look to undergrad students, we see about 57% women, 40% racialized individuals, 3% Indigenous, 22% persons with disabilities. If we look to the general population, almost 51% women, 22% racialized, almost 5% Indigenous, and almost 23% people with disabilities, and LGBTQ2S+, about 3%. You say, well, how is that relevant? I think it is relevant when we start thinking about labor force and we start thinking about who's in our universities and start asking ourselves questions about who are in our organizations. So if this is who's in university, and there's an argument to be said, and I come from, as I said, an area of women in leadership as my starting point, my initial draw to this is around the notion of, if you look at the top, which I won't go on, is looking at who's leading universities. And so we see a difference in regards to who's in our universities and who's leading our universities. And I might suggest as well, if we start to look to our organizations outside of universities, I suspect we don't see that same level of diversity. And in some ways, I think this is perhaps a rhetorical question. Does this reflect the mining sector? And I suspect not, and I know I can't comment on the stats across all of the equity deserving groups, but I certainly can in some of the areas. So I don't want to downplay the work that is being done in the mining sector, and in fact, as I go forward, I'm going to talk about some amazing things that have been happening, chemical work that's being done, IMII work that's being done in some of the other organizations here in the room. So that's not my intent. My intent is to say we have a long way to go. And how is it actually we're able to make more progress more quickly over time. I also am going to make the suggestion that this is relevant to STEM fields, but I think if we look across the other areas as well, arts that have been said, business, there's plenty of opportunity as well. So the mining industry is lagged in managing diversity, gender diversity. Depending on the stats you look at, you'll get anywhere between 14 to 16% if we look at women in the executive ranks. Some stats have talked about 18% on industry board positions, 13% in C-suite executive roles in 2020. Some reports will say the overall workforce in Canada, about 16% in mining is women, or made up of women. And again, that's only looking at one aspect of diversity. I don't have the stats. There may be others, and we start looking at some of the other areas. What we are seeing in the mining sector is when we're looking at diversity initiatives, most of them I would say are focusing upon women and also Indigenous persons, and not necessarily some of these other considerations of diversity. This is a recent study, a recent report that was put out in 2020, where the authors looked at the diversity statements by 25 of the top 50 global mining companies by market cap. And so headquartered across 12 countries that account for 90% of the value. They looked at such items as non-discriminatory practices, resource practices such as forming diversity, networking groups, and work-life initiatives, and thirdly, accountability practices. What's interesting is the narratives in the diversity reports speak to a wide range of diversity considerations, so gender, ethnicity, race, disability, nationality, religious belief, cultural background, and experience. But the actual diversity initiatives typically straddle only a couple of those, and mostly around gender and Indigenous people. I'm not going to argue that there is a moral imperative. I'm also not going to engage in much around the business case and the business need, but it is worth mentioning. So lots of research has indicated that companies who prioritize or that prioritize diversity and inclusion, some stats say are up to 20% more likely to deliver above average profitability and greater long-term value. Most of those studies have looked at gender. So again, when we start talking about what we mean by diversity, a Deloitte report in 2018 talked about, from a survey of mining companies, those with higher diversity correlated to better performance and corporate decision making. There's lots of research out there that's broader than mining that talks about more ethical decision making, difference in risk taking, a number of different positive outcomes when we have more diverse workforces. This may be interesting. Recently, the Mining Industry Human Resources Council, in a post-pandemic report, talked about, they did a survey, and of the 3,000 people between the ages of 15 and 24 who were surveyed, 42% of them stated they definitely would not consider a career in mining. Now, they're not talking in there in regards to some of the identity markers or considerations, but I think that also gets to a point in regards to there is a high need for workers and labor. So that same report talks about how the Canadian mining industry will need to hire over 80,000 new workers to fill vacant positions by 2025. And in a small sample of 3,000 people, but statistically, that's still a fairly high confidence interval. If we're saying 42% of young adults are saying they wouldn't consider, there are broader issues we need to be looking at, and I think post-secondary institutions in partnership with industry and partnership with nonprofits there's a lot of opportunity. What do I mean then by diversity, equity, and inclusion? Diversity is about ensuring people from a range of backgrounds are participating in all levels of work. Equity is a recognition that different people, different groups will require different kinds of support in order to access the same opportunity. And inclusion is this notion that, at least how I understand it, is that not only is there diversity in the workplace, so there is representation from a variety of different people and different groups, that barriers to participation are removed, and that there is both a sense of belonging and uniqueness is valued, so that there are cultures whereby people feel they can be a part of a group and their perspectives are valued, but at the same time their contributions mean they don't have to suppress their own individuality in order to be part of the group. This is important because a lot of what we talk about is diversity and how do we actually increase numbers. And I would argue actually numbers matter, because if the numbers are low, then we're not making any change. But there is more to do than just getting women, Indigenous people, racialized people into the mining industry. There's a lot more that has to happen prior to and after. Now, here's where I think there's lots of things being done. I would argue, again, most of what, at least what I know, is being done around women and being done around Indigenous people. So just a couple of examples of things that are happening. So IMII has made also tons of investment around Indigenous people and groups and women in STEM, specifically in post-secondary, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those things as I move forward. There are organizations that are in place. There's a couple here at the top in mining in Canada that focus on women, and a lot around mentorship, creating opportunities for women. The International Women in Resources Mentoring Program, and there's some sponsors of that there, very similar, right? So again, recognizing the mentorship opportunities. If you haven't seen it, of course, the Mining Association of Canada has released something around advancing diversity and inclusion, and they give some great examples from organizations, Chemico included, that what they are doing in their organizations and initiatives around unconscious bias training to be able to start to change some of the cultures in which we want to be able to have diverse workforces. Down here, what you'll see is an initiative that's come out really post-pandemic, a number of initiatives through this, but Rosie, the Riveter, reinvested, and again, a number of This one focuses on kind of post-pandemic mentoring programs that not only for mining, but I would say STEM. So there's lots of great things happening. I'm coming at it from today in the sense of saying I don't think there's enough happening fast enough, and I think post-secondary institutions do have a large role to play in that. Some suggestions I might make in thinking about how it is we move forward, and I'm going to suggest one of it is around tackling stigma. So coming from a place whereby I do research on what we often call dirty work, and the stigma that comes with those types of occupations that may be physically, socially, and or in other ways that they may be tainted and that type of thing. I believe that there are lots of opportunities for mining, but I think in regards to some of the underrepresented groups, I think there has to be work that is done post-secondary education institutions, but also in industry in regards to changing and putting out a different image or portraying and recognizing and tackling some of those traditional stereotype views as to what mining is about and the opportunities that are there. I think it is part of that is about generating awareness. And I say this from a place whereby, again, in a business school, and we're doing some work, for example, around ag and we have lots of students who come from farms when they come in the business. And lots of them go out to work, Farm Credit Canada, Connexus, all kinds of organizations that are working around ag. What's really interesting is very few of our students actually, when they come in, are actually recognizing where might those opportunities be. And I would make the same argument for mining. And so it is about getting them early, starting, creating possibilities for them so they see, wow, this is an opportunity for me in an industry that I wouldn't necessarily have considered. I talk about getting them early, and I think ideally, the earlier we can get them, the better. In high school, and there's all kinds of research around kind of the STEM and considerations. But from a post-secondary perspective, I would argue getting them right in first year, when some of them have not made their decision around their major. So in engineering, which area they might change. In business, I can say we have lots of students who come in and think they're going to be accountants until they do their first or second accounting course and realize, okay, that's not quite what I thought it was going to be. And so getting them early in their first year, actually they start to be able to see other opportunities and where there are possibilities. And that's where partnerships come in. I have here as well, make it hard to resist and make it meaningful. And what I mean by that is part of this comes down to what I see, the collaboration between post-secondary or educational institutes, industry, government, as well as organizations like IMII. And this is already happening. But I think if we look at the initiatives, we see pockets of different things happening, and not necessarily coming together in a coherence to bundle all those things and the impact that can be made. So this notion when I say make it hard to resist and make it meaningful, in particular about making it hard to resist, if we're talking about scholarships and awards, I know the IMII does one, I think it was U of S, and it's like a $12,000 scholarship, okay? I'd say that's fairly meaningful. And so if you want to be able to have the impact, we need to be thinking about those large scale impacts for people. And I'm also going to say, have that longer term vision. And Jeremy, you really also talked about that. We want change now, but some of those initiatives mean we have a number of years to be able to get those people through the pipeline. I have just a couple of minutes. So some of the strategy I suggest, and it aligns some of the things that Jeremy has said. One of the things that I've put here at the top are around micro-credentials. From at least, I think Sask Poly is better. I know we have people here are better than I think the universities, or say the more traditional U of S and U of R in micro-credentialing. I think we're all in there, but there needs to be more of that. I think often there is a fear that if we have shorter term credentials, people are not going to do degrees. I think it's harder when, in engineering schools that are accredited, like how do we actually do these micro-credentials? But I loved what Jeremy talked about in the notion of it's not necessarily that people will just do these and not do their degree, but maybe it's also after they have a degree as a starting point, that how is it actually we can get them back to do these little pockets of advancement and then be able to do almost that active learning and back in their workforces. Advisory committees, and I know there are schools that do this, and these things are tricky. So talking about what are the needs, I see one of the ways of the bridging is actually more of these advisory committees where we have industry people coming in to look at, and I'm coming from academia, I know how hard this is on the academic side, coming in to actually looking regularly at curriculum, right, and talking about, well, what's missing. And I think that is a tricky balance to get. Industry wants it to happen now. Academia takes, there's 6 levels of approval we have to go through. But there's trust that happens over time, right, where we are able to get in that middle place. I also believe that on the one hand, money will speak in the sense that if I have a potential partner in industry who says there's $100,000 or here's $1 million, and what is it you can do with programming? Well, it's much easier to convince and make change in an institution or area if you can say, let's do this non-credit programming, we can put it in place, but actually this is not going to take away any of our current resources. What is it we can put in place to be able to make some of those changes? The other thing I've had here is around novel programming. So I've seen some work around in mining with virtual reality, and some of you actually may be playing in some of these areas, but going back to the notion of tackling stigma and actually tackling, why wouldn't I want to do this, but building actual virtual reality components into some of the programming, some of the recruitment sessions for students, I think you'll start to see, well, actually, how fun is this, or how fun could it be? This is not what I expected it to be. I know I'm at time. A couple of things around the targeting program and awards that I think is important. We often have a discomfort, and we think about who are we disadvantaging by saying, actually, here are 3 $30,000 scholarships for Indigenous people in mining, or there are 10 of them, or here they are for racialized persons. Really important, I would say, though, because if you want to make change, I would argue one is not enough. We need multiple, and I think there has to be that willingness that they may not all decide to pursue that field, and that's why the longer term view. The last 2 things I am going to talk about are opportunities. There are a couple of examples here, actually, that I support already with U of S that are, I think, fantastic. Al may be able to speak to them. This is here in the audience about MyTechs and have opportunities where by partnering with industry, and during the pandemic, lots of changes happened to actually, I would argue, make it pretty easy for industry to be able to partner. Some of you may be familiar with the Gearing Up, which is a national initiative where organizations can get up to $7,000. I believe that's the number, $7,000 is 1-page form that needs to be completed, basically around getting students in mining and doing internships. That makes it fairly easy. And again, small commitment, students are always looking for jobs, but those are the times when you're able to make an impact. Last 2 things I'll say, and these are coming from business. I know in other disciplinary areas, teaching cases are not often used. Some do. I think in health studies they do. When you talk about making a meaningful impact, we have a partnership with the Ivy School of Business where we educators partner with industry, and they write teaching cases, but right now they have a focus on Western Canadian businesses. We're doing some now that have an EDI focus, so it will be the key protagonist, key decision maker will represent somebody from an equity deserving group. I might suggest that those types of initiatives, if sponsored from someone in industry, whether that's in engineering, whether that's in computer science, whether that happens to be in arts, create opportunities, because in the classroom the students are getting exposed to those real live organizations that they otherwise wouldn't. And lastly, sponsored events. And this goes back to my comment around making it meaningful. Often, industry are incredibly generous around scholarships, around awards, around research grants, that type of thing. And I'm not saying that I want industry to stop doing those things. I want you to continue to do those things. Where I have observed real impact in regards to where some employers have created, potential employers have created relationships, is that if anyone here from industry, you're going to give donor dollars, think long and hard about or ask questions about directing initiatives to where you get direct access to students, and how many of them and how often, and you keep doing them over and over. And I'll give you an example that's transferable. I won't say the firm, but I can say that some of the big four accounting firms, we've seen a shift in regards to where students might be going, and some of them are going to some of the smaller growing firms. We have a partner who actually does some scholarships, but actually they direct their dollars to our student society and events, and they say, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this, because at every single thing we do, and they're there, they get access to 50, 150 students every single time, and maybe sometimes more. What is amazing is they have created this cycle now where actually many of our top accounting students are actually choosing this firm. There's 10 students that are all graduates already in there. What are they doing? They're recommending to the current students to be able to do it. So there are ways to have big impact around smaller things that actually we through partnershiping. I said I didn't have that much to say, but clearly I lied. I will stop there and open it up to questions.
Yes, thank you so much for that great presentation. And I'm looking at the mentorship that you mentioned. I want to know if you are looking at mentorship in terms of students going to the mining sector for internship, or are you thinking more deeply about more interactions between the classroom and the industry? I'll be looking at do you think that if we create more interaction between the people in the mining industry and the classroom, for example, inviting people from the mining sector to come to the classroom and discuss about opportunities in the mining sector, maybe this might help change this thinking that mining is a dirty business, which is not. And unfortunately today we still see students thinking having that thought that mining is dirty, nobody wants to go in there. So do you think by organizing more interactions between classroom and the sector that will help?
Absolutely. Again, I don't think these things change overnight. I think getting students access to people, I think also not only the industry, but I would say that if there are individuals who, I know there's this simple phrase, you hear it all the time, you have to see it to be it or to believe it type of thing, that I believe if there are individuals who represent a particular equity deserving group, I think if they're the ones you can get in the classroom, I think the impact will be even more powerful if we're trying to get women, if we're trying to get racialized persons, if we're trying to get Indigenous people. But absolutely. One of the other things I might say around mentoring can be a formal, but it can also be informal. Like there are lots of ways to do it, for example, around a series where a smaller group of students get access to CEOs or key people, say from the mining industry, and so you do a series of luncheons, right, where you have a small group of 20 students, 25 students who get access to people, say like Jeremy, that they otherwise would never be able to have access to. And it's through those conversations, through those storytellings, I think all of a sudden we start to see some of the changes. You're not going to get the 25 of them who are going to change their careers, but I would argue if we continue to do it and you get 2 or 3 of those people who decide to take a different path than they would have otherwise, I would call that a good investment.
Hi, Gina. Thank you for an excellent presentation. That was very interesting. And to build on my colleague's question, well, maybe this is more of a comment. We've been doing quite a lot of looking at industry and recruitment and even engagement of students in geoscience programs in post-secondary. And some of the barriers that we've identified through partners like MIR, which was a surprise, is parents. So we never thought that was something important before, so it doesn't matter what our industry messages are, we have to tell parents about things. And I have a colleague who works at a small specialized earth sciences college in Ontario. They have a first year that's general, and so there's an opportunity to attract students into earth science programs in second year. And she had the brilliant year where 2 students wanted to join her program. And both situations, the parents said no, because mining destroys the earth, which is a terrible thing. But the other thing is that's really important for us to all consider is that the decisions with which youth are making career choices is based on making a difference. We all know that in the mining sector, there's so many ways that we make a difference in the world. So I think we have to look at communications. Like you said, we have to have opportunities for people to come into classrooms to mentor and show experiential learning programs. This is a brilliant way to do it, but I think we really have to change our messaging a little bit so that we can appeal to the way in which students make decisions about careers. And really, we were surprised to find out how influential parents are, so maybe we need to think about that messaging too. Thanks so much.
Yeah, those are great comments and incredibly interesting. This, what I'll say now is a little bit gendered, and so, but there's work out there that also talks about in regards to looking at women and that notion of, not, and so like, this is a stereotype, it's not, doesn't reflect all women's youth, but there is research that supports it, that notion in making career decisions, similar to what you say in regards to wanting to be connected to something with a greater purpose and impact. And so again, in the messaging and the and how these careers are being presented is really, really important. And so you highlight that notion around, you know, the younger generation and the view, and it goes back to, you know, tackling, first I think identifying and understanding what some of that potential stigma is, and how are those messages being communicated, so that purpose, that contribution can come through. The parents thing, very interesting. Very interesting.
Thank you, Gina. Zsuzsa again from my text. I don't want to take the word away from other people. I'd like to spin that question about parents to the other side. So for a girl to consider mining as their career, I think they have to be able to see themselves as mothers and a career in mining. So my question is more about the invisibly disadvantaged portion of our population who are mothers as opposed to women, because well, I come from STEM, and I find that the most disadvantaged I was, not because I was a woman or because I have an accent, but because I was a mother, and I am a mother. So a lot of my time was spent on that. So if a girl is hearing that at home or seeing that in society, that when she grows up, she doesn't have quality childcare, she wants to be a mother, how do we as a society help be those systemic things in place so they actually see themselves as both? Because most women will give up career to be a mother. It's a very strong instinct. So how do we provide part-time jobs, for example? I think that would be important. How do we tap into that human capital and computing power of mothers? And we need 80,000 people to enter the workforce. There's a lot of mothers out there at home who are completely capable. How do we integrate them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'm the right one to answer. I think our industry folks here can talk perhaps a bit more specifically about some of the challenges of doing that. What I can, I mean, I think it's a super point, and there are a number of things we do have to take into consideration is, you know, the type of work, and I think there are, not only in mining, but I think there are plenty of other industries as well in regards to whether it's part-time, but it's not only, the solution is not only part-time jobs, it's also sometimes how we think about or our expectations of people and the types of work, and we have these traditional notions of what this is the only way it works. And I think we have to change some of that, and I think you're right around mothers, but here's where I will come at it from a perspective that's broader. My experience is that when organizations start to rethink what inclusivity means And you know, what's the final goal, and are there multiple ways we can actually have working arrangements to be able to still achieve that? It's not only women or working mothers that benefit from that. There are all kinds of other people in our workplace that benefit from that. So for example, there are fathers, there are other parents who traditionally, you know, even the paternity practices are better, and we're seeing some changes, and I think it's across industries, but there's still an awful lot of stigma for people who identify as men and who are fathers to actually take time away, and are still sometimes punished indirectly when they come back from paternity leaves. So my argument, I don't think I have a great answer in regards to how we fix it, but what I can say is I don't see it just as a mother issue. I think that actually in thinking about and unsettling some of our traditional notions as to this is what a work life has to look like, and instead thinking about, well, what are the outcomes? What are we trying to achieve? And what are the different ways we might be able to create, you know, working environments to get those same goals? It won't only be working mothers that you'll actually start to see a change in the diversity of your workforce. There will be others. And I can say when it comes, I'm old, I think now, but when I start to look, when you talk about the comments about some of the younger generations, which I don't always fully understand, but their expectations are very different than I would say what my expectations are of a workforce and from an employer. And quite frankly, they're not staying, right? They will start, the money will not keep them because they want to have something that's meaningful. They want to have a different working life than I might sometimes still get frustrated by. I'm thinking, come on, where did loyalty go in organizations? So your point is on the mark, but I would also say in looking at that and changing some of those working conditions and working practices, organizations are actually going to see a difference in other areas of diversity that they didn't expect.
Maybe I'll just add to that.
Okay, good. You're not allowed to ask me a question. You're just allowed to comment. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah, so I thought you did a great job answering. I really appreciate the fact you asked that question, because it's a great question. And maybe I'll just add a little bit of a technology overlay and an industry view on it. And the way we are looking at it, or at least the way I've been able to exercise enabling some of that capacity and that talent, is by using the technology. Some of the stuff that's come out through the pandemic has actually created space for us, right? So through flex time, not being geographically constrained. I know some of the other mining companies out there are now creating the ability to operate their facility from, you know, distances that are way beyond the communities that they may be actually sitting in. So you can actually have jobs that, I'll give you an example. In some of our northern communities, we've got Indigenous people who are in a family situation where they have had to leave, and we say, wait a second, I can, because of the portable nature of the job and the technology, I can actually take that off of the site or take it out of the corporate office, and I can move it back into your community, and you can do it on a flexible work schedule that works for you. And that individual happened to do things for me like computer-based training. Right, was not in her normal training, her background, but we ran her through some courses, and she picked this up and she ran with it. And it was just one of those good examples of using technology to reduce that geographic constraint and then create the flexibility where we can tap into that capacity.
Great.
Well, I really like the comment around culture, and something that generationally, but I would suggest broadly, people are looking for to join an organization. And at BHP, it's we're bringing together people and resources to create a better world. And we're fortunate to be in a province within an industry that's experiencing a boom, much like we've seen in 2004, 2005. And the issues that you've highlighted around our ability to attract to this industry, to this province, to some of the capital-intensive work that's happening, isn't really a individual company problem to solve, but yes, it needs to be solved for us. It's regional. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about what you're encouraged by or discouraged by in terms of the partnerships that exist between industry, community, and education. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great point. And Al and I were speaking about it this morning. Again, I think there are great examples of pockets of things that we're seeing where industry, government, post-secondaries are coming together. IMII plays a big role in some of those initiatives. what I would like to advocate for is, I think the operationalizing of it is more difficult. I admit to that. But what I would love to see is an inter-university approach, so where the post-secondaries are coming together, industry is coming together, so that we're not competing. So I'm not competing with your company to be able to, I want the sponsor dollars to come here. U of S wants the sponsor dollars. I mean, I know it seems a bit idealistic, but I also would argue that I think from I'll say a regional perspective, having a sector-specific approach. And so during COVID, I can say this, the post-secondary institutions, mostly agreed in regards to the approaches they were going to take around the COVID protocols, right? So Sask Poly, U of R, U of S. So if we can do it in those types of situations, why can we not say actually that there's a huge demand in mining and there isn't enough right now skilled labor to be able to go in there? Why can't we adopt a similar type of regional approach where we say, okay, and I think the government is doing this, but I think it requires having the players at the table to say, the post-secondary institutions are saying, yeah, it's a mining focus. Getting the industry players coming in to say, yes, this is the mining focus. And so what are the initiatives and the areas whereby actually we can work together and we kind of use that money? Right now, I think what we're doing, some great initiatives, but it's kind of like these pockets that are all over the place that I think will have some impact, but not the same kind of impact if actually we can come together in some sort of consortium or something to be able to have that real impact across that, not only STEM, but I think about business, I think about arts, and across the post-secondary and the industry players. I think getting that to happen is hard. I think IMII is an organization that actually does that type of thing. But I would agree, and I think, someone else, there will be others. I think in Saskatchewan, I think about, for example, ag, mining, I think about tech, and you're talking about, the post-secondary institutions in this province and others are highly funded by government. And so I'm not encouraging government to be putting any more pressure on post-secondary institutions about where their focus should be. But there are levers. There are levers that can be pulled in regards to where the focus goes and how we actually do something in a far more concerted effort to be able to address this. And I think pulling those resources, brains, and dollars together, we all benefit from that. Great point.
All right, with that, we're going to bring the morning session to a close. I'm going to ask Jeremy to come back up and join us. We have gifts for both of our speakers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.